Good evening.
I'm really excited to be here. The special event that has been organized and is hosted by Drs. Patricia Mitchell and Tyree Robinson, and organized also by Shantae Reed and Tom Lee. We have the distinct pleasure this evening to be joined by Delaine Eastin. Ms. Eastin is an educator, politician, and multi-generation, I just learned, San Franciscan. She was the first and only woman to be elected to the California State Superintendent of Public Instruction under Governors Pete Wilson and Gray Davis. Her political career began in 1980 when she became a member of the Union City Council, and she later served 6 terms on the State Assembly. Eastin represents the best in leadership, having held leadership roles in the corporate and nonprofit sectors, as well as in public service and within institutions of higher education, including Ventura, De Anza, Canada Community Colleges, and also Mills College in Oakland. We have much to learn from her life and example, and I'm sure that she will inspire us tonight, at a time when we need desperately to be inspired. Perhaps we can be reminded of the role each of us can play in safeguarding rights and opportunities, as well as the possibility of having ethical leadership, such as Delaine Eastin has presented in her career. Thank you so much for spending the evening with us and for lending your wisdom and sharing your insights. Thank you.
It's wonderful to be here tonight, and I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to address you. I want to say a special thanks to Brad, who worked hard to get me here and helped me get organized, as well as a special thanks to Dr. Patricia Mitchell, who I've heard rave reviews from Constance about. My good friend Constance, who's joined me tonight, also got her doctorate at a little school called USF. So nice to have a veteran here with me. I've got to get this microphone right. So let me just say to all of you, I love Phi Delta Kappa's commitment to service, research, and leadership. If you could focus in education on 3 essential items, it would be that. Service, first and foremost. I like to remind people what Neil Postman said. Children are living messages we send to a time we will never see. The most important thing we do in this state and in our nation is to educate our children. That is the most important work of a generation for the next generation. And I will say that, in fact, right now we need you, yes, in classrooms and in universities. Yes, we need you on school boards and in leadership positions at a variety of different think tanks. But we also need you as citizens to demand that our state and our country step up to the plate and educate our children, all of our children. And it needs to be done with a sense of sacred responsibility. I will just tell you that tonight I'm actually really concerned about leadership in our state and our nation. I don't think you should be complacent because you're in one party or the other. The fact is that there is not enough leadership in this state and in this country around the future of our children. How did we get here? A bunch of people that didn't hardly have 2 nickels to rub together, who came out of a terrible depression and a great war, decided that they should educate all of their children. And no place did it better than California. The fact is, we had a commitment to each and every child that we would give them an opportunity to get started and an opportunity to succeed. And it meant that a whole bunch of children that grew up in the state of California, whose parents did not go to college, nonetheless had a chance to go to college and to university. Yes, and not all of them went to college. Some went into career and technical training. I once debated Milton Friedman about the voucher. And we were down in Silicon Valley, and this man got up and he said, I want a voucher because I can't worry about other people's children. I'm worried about my 3 kids. I want my 3 kids to have a great education. And I want to be able to put them in a private school with a voucher. I just can't worry about other people's children. I said, oh, you don't fly? He said, well, I fly all the time. Well, next time you're on a plane, remember somebody else's kid is the pilot. Somebody else's child is the machinist to machine the parts in that wing assembly when it lifts up so perfectly and you land safely. And somebody else's child is in the air traffic control tower seeing you and your family safely home. This country runs on other people's children. We have a sacred responsibility to all of them. Now, I will tell you that I did start to school in San Francisco, California. It's a school that's no longer open. It was named San Miguel. Later became the site of Leadership High School. But in fact, I was in a classroom of 44 children. Now, that's all I'd ever been in, so I didn't know what I was missing. My dad spent 22 years in the Navy, and at the end of the Korean War, he got out of the Navy, and my parents looked around. They could have bought a bigger house for less money. They bought the little house that cost more. You know why? Schools were better. So I went from a classroom of 44 children in San Francisco to a classroom where I was the 20th child in San Carlos, California. And you know what? When I became superintendent of public instruction, one of the first things I did was fight to reduce class size in kindergarten through 3rd grade, and we did it. By the way, the teacher in San Francisco was a good teacher. Her name was Mrs. Poole, but she had 44 children. The teacher in San Carlos was a good teacher, Mrs. McClaws, but she only had 20 children. And so I was at the top of the class when I left San Francisco, but I was kind of in the middle of the pack when I got to San Carlos because they were moving along. And the fact is, by the way, when I went to Britton Acres, I discovered there was a thing called a library and a librarian. Mrs. Firth had me read. She took me aside one day, the librarian, and she said, "Honey, you like to read. Could I recommend some books to you?" I said, "Oh, yes." She had me read every biography about a woman that was in that library. And the fact was, there weren't that many about women in those days, but I read every one of them. The fact is, there was a nurse at my elementary school. She called my mother. Said, "Get that girl's eyes checked. She needs to wear glasses, I think." And guess what? I did. And I've told that story all over the state, and I've had many people come up to me afterward and said, "Yeah, that was me." But today, and when I got to Carmel High School, I was in college prep. I wanted to go to college. Counselor calls me into her office the first day of school. I've never been called in somebody's office. Calls me in the office and chews me out because I was in college prep, not university prep. I didn't know the difference. I tell you those stories because today in California, we are dead last in the number of counselors, nurses, and librarians. The fact is that we have not been investing in our kids' education. When I first got to the legislature, and I actually only served 4 terms, but when I got to the legislature, I had someone who gave me a study that had been done about the California school libraries. Turns out we had the worst library book collection in the country. Fewest number of titles per student and the oldest books in America. Fewest number of periodicals and reference materials. So I went around and I started looking at school libraries. I have a whole shelf in my garage of books I took off of library shelves. There's one called Rockets into Space. That was in the Bakersfield School Library. It said, in 1987, when I found it, in a few years, men in spacesuits will walk on the moon. That was 20 years after that had happened. There's a book called I Still Have, called I'm Glad I'm a Boy, I'm Glad I'm a Girl. Boys fix things, girls need things fixed. Girls can cook, boys can eat. Boys build houses, girls keep houses. Boys are presidents, girls are first ladies. Well, the fact is that those books were the worst, most disgusting, was called Men at Arms. It talked about warriors around the world. The chapter on Africa was called An African Savage. It was on a California bookshelf in 1988. And so indeed, we worked hard. The first bill I wrote to improve school libraries, George Deukmejian vetoed. He wrote the nicest veto I ever got. He said that the author has a noble purpose, but she has to identify a revenue stream. It's called fiscal conservatism. Fact is, I went to Johan Claes, who was chair of Rev and Tax, and I said to him, "Johan, I need some money to fix the school libraries." He said, "Well, go on, I got a good source of revenue for you, but I don't think you can get it out of the legislature." I said, "Tell me." He said, "Well, we have, remember, this is the 80s, we have relatively low tobacco taxes on cigarettes, but we have zero taxation on chewing tobacco, pipe tobacco, snuff, and wait for it, cigars. If you just tax those products at the same rate we're taxing cigarettes, you'll wind up with 5 times what you need. We can really help the libraries." But I don't know if you can get it out of committee. The tobacco industry is very powerful in Sacramento. Ladies and gentlemen, when I showed up at the committee, 4 of the members came in, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, smoking cigars and cigarettes. It was disgusting. And so when Rob Reiner put first 5 on the ballot, Prop 10, to tax tobacco products to do preschool, guess who was the honorary co-chair? That was me, and we won. And later when I got into the superintendency, and this is, there's various kinds of leadership, but when I was elected superintendent, remember, we elect 8 constitutional officers every 4 years in the state of California, okay? 8 every 4 years. When I was elected state superintendent, I not only became the first, and I'm still the only woman to have that job. There had only been a total of 3 women in history in any constitutional office before then. Guess what? We've only had a total of 9. We only have 1 today. The fact is, it really is time for us to get a group of people leading the state that look more like the people in this room. There needs to be more diversity, but there also needs to be more gender diversity. And I will say this to you, I believe very strongly that there are times that you do have to lead. And right now in California, every single Californian needs to stand up for education. At every single level. The reality is we are terribly underinvested. To hear them talk, they're all pounding themselves on the back. We got local control funding formula. We put a lot more money back into schools. Guess what? When I graduated from high school, we were tied with New York at 5th of the 50 states. We dropped as low as 47th. When I took office, I sued Pete Wilson for the money to do class size reduction, and I won the lawsuit. That's where I got the money. But guess what else? When I got there, when I got to the election, and there were only 3 Democrats elected constitutional officers out of 8, and we lost the assembly, so Pete Wilson went after the immigrants. And it gave him, in the short run, a very red state. In the long run, he turned the state blue. But at that time, about half of the Latinos were Democrats and half were Republicans. Now they're overwhelmingly Democrats. Took a while. Bottom line is, the day after he was elected, Pete Wilson had put Prop 187 on the ballot. Some of you may remember it. It said that no undocumented immigrant, including their children, was entitled to any public services in the state of California, including school. And it said that the teachers should actually do background checks to make sure their students were here legally. Did you ever meet a teacher that wanted to do immigration naturalization service work? I didn't. So the bottom line is that the day after the election, he went before the press and said, the first thing that new superintendent needs to do is issue the guidelines for getting those kids out of school that don't belong there. And the press came to me and said, the governor says you should issue these guidelines. I said, you tell the governor I'll see him in court. And we beat him. We won. We defeated Prop 187 in the courts because it isn't the job of the teachers to do background checks on their students. But I will say to all of you, when you think about the cradle of civilization, cradle of civilization where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers came together and humanity was started. You've heard that story. If you look at the Silicon Valley, there is no Tigris. There is no Euphrates. How did the Silicon Valley get born in the Bay Area? It's universities like the University of San Francisco. It's universities like Stanford and Cal and San Jose State and Cal State East Bay and Santa Clara University. It's all of these great institutions that together created a fertile crescent of civilization that spawned the Silicon Valley. And that's why Hollywood is here as well. Lots of great opportunities for people to use their creativity. Ladies and gentlemen, the biblical line, cast your bread upon the waters and it will return to you 1,000-fold, is nowhere truer than in education. You educate them, you don't have to incarcerate them. And so I will tell you that, by the way, since 1985, we built publicly 1 UC campus. We built 3 Cal State University campuses and 9 community colleges. Do the math. That's 13 campuses since 1985. In that same period of time, we built 23 prisons. We have dropped, when I left office, we were 27th in per pupil spending. After Arnold got into office, when we had the recession, we dropped down. This evening, we're in the bottom 10 of the 50 states in per pupil investment in K-12, but we are #1 in per prisoner investment, and that's not an investment, that's an expense. It's a waste of our money. If we educated these kids, we wouldn't have to incarcerate them. It's time for California to get its priorities straight again. And so I say to all of you, I really do believe that when we talk about leadership, we have to remember that people can lead for good or ill. When Pete Wilson supported Prop 187, he was doing an ill. He was doing an evil thing, I think. But he was doing it, he wanted to be president, so he thought that was how he was going to position himself. This president thinks by going after the immigrants, he's positioning himself. And in my lifetime, I have seen so many good people as Democrats and Republicans who have worked together for the benefit of children. I figured out in the legislature, I'm a Democrat, as some of you know, superintendent is a nonpartisan race. But there was a wonderful woman, there were several wonderful women who we were all, the year I was elected, 1986. Do the math here with me. We got the vote in California in 1911. 75 years after we got the vote, I got elected to the legislature. I was on the cover of the California Journal, biggest freshman class of women in history. 5. We'd had a total of 31 women before I was elected in 75 years. A total of 31 women. With the 5 of us, we went all the way up to 16 women in the legislature. The fact is, the research shows when you get more women in elected office, more is spent on education, families, healthcare, and seniors. Sounds about right to me. The truth is that right now in California and America, we need a push to get a much more diverse group of people who will stand for the people of this state. The idea that the leaders of both parties went into the back room and sold out to the sugary drink lobby and said we aren't going to let any local government raise taxes on sugary drinks for 10 years is disgraceful, disgusting, immoral, and just plain wrong. And so I say to all of you that there are things that we need to change. And here's the challenge for you in education. We've got to inspire a whole new generation of people to enter education, because there are a lot of young people that are retiring into other jobs because they can't make a living as teachers. They're moving out of education. I had a teacher call me from Morgan Hill, California. You know where that is, just south of San Jose. But guess what? Because it's just south of San Jose, it's now the Silicon Valley. This dad, who's the teacher, is living in a 400 square foot apartment with his wife and 3 children. He calls, somebody suggested that he call me, and I said, well, I really suggest you look honestly in the valley. You can still afford to buy a housing in the valley, and you might be able to. He's been saving his money, and his wife wasn't working because the babies were little. But I said, now Morgan Hill prices are really high. And so he says, all right. So he goes and he finds a job in the Sacramento area. He and his wife put a down payment on a house. It's a modest little house, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1-car garage, but it's a house. They were so excited. He goes home, he puts in his resignation letter, and the Morgan Hill School District said, not so fast, not so fast. You can't resign, it's June. You had to notify us in March. He calls me back, he's hysterical. He says, Delaine, I either lose my deposit on the house or I have to sleep in a van. What do I do? I said, you call the personnel director, make sure he knows you're calling the superintendent, you call the head of the state of your unified board, and then you make sure you use the words indentured servitude is illegal in California repeatedly. And make sure they know you're coming down to testify in front of the television about what they're doing to you. They gave him the excuse that'll let him go. And so he lived happily ever after, I understand. But here's the deal. Leadership is really about finding can-do people who can help you do this. And that's one of the things about leadership in schools. I will just tell you that after I left the superintendency, I ran the National Institute for School Leadership back in Washington, D.C. It's part of the National Center for the Education and the Economy. I read a lot about leadership. And the truth is that, in the military, in business, in so many other areas. We do the kind of work that you're doing here in this doctoral program. But education has often neglected this issue of leadership. The fact is, fish stinks from the head. I've never been to a great school that doesn't have a great principal. I've never been to a great school district that doesn't have a great superintendent. The fact is, leadership is important, and yet we discount it. When I was a kid, you know how they picked the principal? Fred, Ralph, Sam. You know, it was always the guy who'd been in the military who became the principal. There were no women principals when I was a kid. Fact is, they didn't. Even though most of the teachers were, even a higher percentage in those days, were female. But the reality is we have to take the time to focus on leadership and education. And it's got to look more like the team building leadership that you do find in the private sector, you do find in the military, and they do take the time to train their people to lead. So I will just say for all of you, let me say one other thing. When I proposed class size reduction, Pete Wilson made fun of me. He ridiculed me. 20 to 1, you know, $2.3 billion, are you nuts? Well, I was suing him for the money. So I said to him, if I win the money, you know, it'll just go sprinkled around and we won't make a difference. But if we focus on doing one really big important thing, we can make a difference. And so my bill, which was going to phase in over a 4-year period, so we'd have time to get the portable buildings and have time to get the credentialed teachers, have time to do the work. He made fun of me for 6 months, and finally he said, all right, Delaine, I've decided to do the class size reduction, but instead of 4 years, we'll do it in 6 weeks. Oh, and I didn't give you any staff or any money well, guess what? I had a brilliant woman who's former mayor of Davis, one of the people who started the Davis Farmers Market, my former chief of staff. She wasn't working, didn't want to be my chief of staff in the building, because that's 43% of the state budget. She wanted to do something focused and narrow, because she had a 5-year-old. Well, guess what? She was on fire, because she wanted that 5-year-old to get class size reduction. So she was working, she went from working, you know, a part-time shift to working 60 hours a week, but in the evening she'd go down to Davis Joint Unified School Board and make sure that they offered it in 3 grades, which is what you could do the first year. So that Hatley got the opportunity to have a class size of 20 or less. And so when you, even without money, even without time, if you've got good people around you, they can move mountains. Because you do it with teams. You get people motivated to help you move the needle. And you do it focusing on the children. I will tell you there's some other things that we need to be doing in Sacramento. We need to be doing some long-range planning. So, the long-range water plan for California was done under Pat Brown, 1957. You want to know why you spent $1.1 billion on Oroville Dam? It's because we haven't been planning on maintenance, not just on dams, but on roads and freeways and bridges, on all sorts of things, and certainly not on schools. The state plan for higher education, the master plan for higher education, was done under Pat Brown in 1960. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to plan. It's time to make sure we give support. At one point, when I was working for Jan Holmgren, who was president of Mills, I was teaching, and I was distinguished professor of educational leadership, but all of a sudden the state legislature was going to stop giving financial support to students in private colleges and universities. They were going to save the state money that way. And so I had to go up and lobby them and say, are you crazy? We have a bunch of people working at USF. People working at Stanford. There are people working at Santa Clara. They're paying taxes and they're educating our kids. And by the way, we're all in this together. Don't look at the state school system as some kind of layer cake. It's a marble cake. And many of you in this room have been in various institutions in your lives. So we all have to fight for each other and for all of education in California. I'm going on a little long, but I just want to say there's one other big thing we have got to do in this state. We have to have universal preschool. We are way overdue for child development from birth to age 3 and preschool from age 3 to 5. Kindergarten needs to be full day and it needs to be mandatory. 15 states have mandatory preschool. And let me say one last thing. When you look around, the world looked at California and said, how'd they get so rich? You know, you realize we're not only the biggest economy in the country, we're the 5th largest economy in the world. We have passed Great Britain. The 5th largest economy in the world. Gives you chills, doesn't it? And the reality is we got here because people invested in education. That's how we got to be the 5th largest economy. It wasn't a gift from the gods. It was that we put our shoulder to the wheel and we educated kids. In fact, at the end of the Second World War, the federal government had paid for preschool, for child development, because so many women were in the workforce. We continued it in California. It's not for everybody, but there is some. But we ought to have a universal preschool in the state of California. And the preschool teachers ought to be like in Italy and France. They ought to be paid what regular elementary school teachers are paid and be given more education so that they can help these kids have a wonderful start, a real head start. I'll leave you with this thought. I was mad at Lyndon Johnson for a lot of years because of the Vietnam War. I have respect for him because of the civil rights movement, so I was torn. But when I went to his ranch outside of Austin, my oldest friend lives there now, I went to the ranch and they moved the one-room schoolhouse that he went to as a child. On the tour guide said, you know, Lyndon's mother came in with Lyndon by the hand and begged the teacher to let him start school at age 4 because he could already read. And the teacher said, you can read, huh? Show me. She said, well, I didn't bring a book. She says, I've got books. Went over and got a book Lyndon had never seen, and she opened it, and he sat down and he read it. And the teacher said he can start school. And Lyndon Johnson said he always felt that starting school at age 4 gave him a head start on his education. That's why it's called Head Start. He started it. I say to each and every one of you, you now have a wonderful head start because you have your doctorates or you're working on your doctorates. It is extremely important that this not just be a credential you hang on the wall, but it's a credential you carry in your heart, that you fight for children and their education. You fight for the children at the margins. I taught at the Youth Authority one semester when I was down in Santa Barbara, and I finished school. I was teaching at Ventura College, and they asked me to teach at the Youth Authority, and I had supposed to have a maximum of 25 incarcerated youth. I had 53. They said, well, we could send 28 of them back to their cells. I said, no, I'll take them, but I need 28 more textbooks. Oh, I don't think we can get them by the end of the semester. So I went down to the UC Santa Barbara bookstore, and I bought 28 copies of the textbook, and I brought it back, and the guy got mad at me. I didn't authorize that. If they didn't pay me back, it would cost me more than I got paid to teach the class. So, but the fact is that I got to know those students because they were supposed to do a research project. They were getting college credit. I got to know them. And their stories were heartbreaking. You know some of these stories. You've heard them. I met a young girl whose mother addicted her to heroin when she was 13 and put her in a stable. The fact is, she shouldn't have been in jail, nor should the young man whose parents just told him to run into a market. Here's $5, go buy a pound of hamburger. He ran into the market and came out and they were gone. He's up in the mountains. These children are children. And we have to do a better job of finding scaffolding for them, and it can't just be prisons. It has to be compassionate and careful, conceived. So I say, when we think about what we're doing, we ought to say, if a bunch of people coming out of a depression and a war could have had such a vision and could have made us the envy of the world, who then copied us and looked at how we were doing, surely to God we can get our memories back. We can make this investment in our kids, and it should be in all levels of education, from preschool to graduate school, public and private, especially higher ed, but also preschool and child development. These little children need to get a good start, a head start, something that'll really put us ahead and help our country. So I say to all of you tonight, thank you for being educators. Thank you for your commitment to the improvement of our children's lives. It's the most important job in America. Thank you.
I feel like I can help. Yeah.
Delaine, thank you so much for the round of applause because it is definitely deserved. We appreciate your vigor. I can see the tears in your eyes. I was quite emotional through your passion. We do want to present you with this token of appreciation for lending your time, for being willing to come and share what we know is so important to you and what I know you will continue to fight in relation to the education that all of our kids so very much so deserve. So again, we say thank you so much and for spending your time with us.
Thank you all very much. Do you want me to take any questions? Or?